Most people think wild animals just move on, that they vanish into the woods, never looking back. But what if I told you one came back, not for help, not for food, but to say thank you? This isn't your typical wildlife rescue story. It's about a bobcat named Bobbie, once broken, once afraid, who left something at my door that shook me to my core. Not a threat, not a mess, a gift, delicate, intentional, impossible to ignore. And it wasn't the object itself that stunned me. It was what it meant. This story will challenge what you believe about wild animals, about gratitude, about the kind of bond that doesn't need words to speak volumes. Because once you hear what that bobcat did, you'll never look at nature the same way again. And the truth is, I'm still trying to understand why me. They found her under the broken shade of a dying pine tree, barely breathing, her ribs showing, one paw twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes dull but still watching. She was wild, no doubt about that. But there was something else behind those golden eyes, something that hadn't given up. That's how Bobbie's story began. The Wildlife Rehab Center had seen its share of broken creatures, but this bobcat was different. Not just because of her injuries, but because of her quiet resistance to giving in. Her rescuer, a retired forest ranger named Helen, had a way with wounded things. Maybe because she'd been broken once herself. Day after day, Helen cleaned Bobbie's wounds, fed her by hand, spoke gently into the silence between them. At first, Bobbie growled through the pain. Then one morning, she didn't. That morning, something shifted. The weeks passed, and bones healed. Muscles returned. But more importantly, trust grew, not forced, not demanded, just offered and somehow returned. In the stillness of that rehab room, two souls, one wild, one worn, found a rhythm together. A rhythm that hummed louder with every step Bobbie took toward recovery. And yet, the forest was calling her back. What no one expected was that Bobbie might come back with something to say. The forest had swallowed her whole again, just as it should. Helen stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Bobbie disappear between the trees like a memory too sacred to chase. That final glance over her shoulder, brief, intense, had said more than words ever could. But it was the next morning that truly left Helen speechless. The sun had barely stretched across the porch when Helen opened her cabin door and froze. There, resting gently atop the weathered wooden step, was a small object, not just random forest debris, but something chosen. A feather, black-tipped, curved, balanced perfectly beside a thin birch twig stripped clean. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, but Helen knew the woods. She knew the randomness of wind, and she knew in her bones this wasn't that. It was a message. The twig was symbolic of strength bent, but not broken, just like Bobbie's leg. The feather, light and untethered, like freedom returned. Helen stared at the offering, heart hammering. Bobbie had come back, not to stay, but to say something. There were no paw prints, no camera footage, just the gift itself, placed with such deliberate gentleness that it sent a chill up Helen's spine. This wasn't just gratitude. It was communication, instinctive, primal, and impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't lived inside that silence with a wild animal. Some would say animals don't feel the way we do, that wild creatures act only on instinct. But then, how do you explain this? Helen didn't need proof. She felt it. The invisible thread that had stretched between her and Bobbie wasn't broken. It had just shifted, stretching across trees and distance, still alive. As she held the twig in her hand, something caught in her throat, not sorrow, not joy, but that deep ache of being seen, truly seen, by a creature that owed her nothing. It wasn't about the gift itself. It was about the intention behind it, the recognition, the connection. And just like that, the door to a larger question creaked open in Helen's mind. one that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with something ancient and unspoken. If a wild animal can return to say, "Thank you," what else are they capable of feeling? Some stories are whispered in the wind, others are carved into bark or echoed in the rustle of leaves. But this story was left at a doorstep in the shape of a feather and a twig, an offering from a wild animal to a human soul. For Helen, that small gesture unlocked something far greater than the objects themselves. It was a reminder of how profoundly wild animals can feel, remember, and respond. Bobbie wasn't just a rescue story with a happy ending. She was proof that connection doesn't always need words, that wildlife can communicate in ways we've forgotten how to hear. Many people imagine wild animals as distant, instinct-driven beings, incapable of affection or meaning beyond survival. But what if we've underestimated them? What if the line between us and them is thinner than we want to believe? Helen had always known the forest was alive, but now it felt awake, as if it had acknowledged her, not just Bobbie, but the entire wild. In that moment she realized the bond they'd formed wasn't just personal, it was ancestral, something rooted deep in time, before language, before fences. That simple gift forced Helen to re-examine everything she thought she knew about empathy. Maybe it wasn't exclusive to humans. Maybe compassion, appreciation, even grief were part of a much older language, one that pulsed quietly in every living being. And it wasn't just Helen who felt it. As she quietly shared the story with her small circle, fellow wildlife volunteers, neighbors who lived close to the tree line, something remarkable happened. People began telling their own stories, of foxes returning to the same doorstep, of birds leaving berries beside a window, of wolves watching silently from a distance, not with menace, but with memory. Bobbie had unknowingly stirred a ripple, a widening recognition that perhaps we've been living alongside sentient souls all along, too distracted or skeptical to notice. This wasn't just about a bobcat. It was about how we, as humans, choose to see the world around us, whether we rush through it or stop long enough to feel the thread connecting us. And as Helen stood under the whispering canopy of trees, she couldn't help but wonder if one rescue could awaken this much beauty. What could happen if more people opened their eyes and their hearts? Bobbie's gift didn't stay quiet for long. It moved like wind through dry grass, subtle but impossible to ignore. One person told another, and soon the story of the bobcat who left a thank you gift at a human's door was being passed along in whispers, in awe, in wonder. People weren't just hearing it, they were feeling it. And that's the thing about stories born in truth and humility. They ripple outward, touching hearts in ways even the storyteller can't predict. Helen never set out to inspire anyone. She just did what felt right, what was needed in a moment of compassion. But when word spread about the wild animal that returned not out of need, but out of choice, something shifted. Local children began leaving little bits of food for the animals at the edge of the woods. Not out of pity, but respect. An elderly man who'd spent years battling loneliness started walking the trails again, hoping to feel what Helen had felt. One family even built a small wooden shelter near the forest line, just in case another animal needed refuge. The story ignited a deeper reflection in people. What else are we not noticing? How often do we walk past life, too buried in noise to hear nature's quiet language? Bobbie's act had created more than a moment. It had stirred something long buried. It reminded people that the world isn't divided into humans and animals, us and them, saviors and saved. It's more like a web, invisible to the eye, but undeniable in its pull, where every action sends out waves we may never see, but others surely feel. And it wasn't just emotion, it was education. Schools invited Helen to speak, Wildlife centers saw more volunteers than ever before. Donations increased, conversations changed. It was no longer about control or fear, but about curiosity, stewardship, and humility. That's what a single act of gratitude from a wild animal had done. But the most powerful ripple of all wasn't in the minds of strangers. It was in Helen's heart. The once retired ranger now saw her role with new eyes. No longer just a caretaker of land, but a listener, a translator of messages written in paw prints and feathers. And as autumn crept in, and the forest changed its clothes once again, Helen found herself standing at the edge of the woods, not waiting, but watching. Because something told her. Bobbie's story wasn't over yet. Kindness has a way of outliving us. Long after the moment has passed, it lingers, in gestures, in memories, in the silent choices we make when no one's watching. For Helen, the rescue had started as a simple act of mercy. But what she couldn't have known was that helping Bobbie would become part of something far greater. A legacy not written in stone, but carried on the paws of wild animals, in the stories they leave behind. Bobbie was gone now, swallowed once more by the mystery of the woods. But her presence was still felt, on the porch where the feather had once rested, in the way Helen spoke to the trees, slower and more intentional than before, and in how people, inspired by her story, began treating wildlife not as curiosities, but as kin. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all, not the feather, not the twig, but the shift, the awakening. Because when people hear about a wild bobcat returning to thank her rescuer, something opens, something softens. The barriers we build between ourselves and nature crack just enough to let the light in. Helen had no desire to be a hero. She never wanted applause. What mattered was the echo, the ripple of compassion that continued to spread long after Bobbie had vanished into the trees. And she knew, deep down, that others could do the same. You don't have to be a wildlife expert. You don't have to live in a cabin in the woods. All it takes is attention, a willingness to act, to care, to offer a second chance to a life that still wants to fight. Whether it's volunteering at a local animal rescue, donating to wildlife conservation, or simply choosing to respect the space and silence of the wild, it all matters. Every act builds the legacy. Helen's bond with Bobbie may have been unique, but the lesson is universal. When we choose compassion over indifference, we make the world not just better, but more alive. And somewhere, in the rustle of autumn leaves, in the hush of early morning fog, maybe, just maybe, there's another creature watching, waiting, hoping, because kindness doesn't end at the edge of the forest. What do you think Bobbie's gift really meant? Was it just instinct, or something deeper, something sacred? Maybe the real question is, how many messages from nature have we ignored simply because we didn't know how to listen? This story wasn't about a rescue. It was about recognition, about two beings, one wild, one human, meeting in a moment of mutual trust. And now, I want to ask you, have you ever felt truly seen by an animal? Have you ever stopped long enough to wonder if they feel just as deeply as we do? If this story touched you, if it made you pause and breathe a little slower, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let others feel what you felt. And if you believe, like I do, that real connections between humans and animals can change lives, subscribe. These stories need to be heard.